And yeah, so it's um, it's really interesting to see the differences, you know, in to what extent the systems here are working vis-a-vis like something like my old country. Now we got a good number of people already starting to join. If you're just joining us, we're gonna wait maybe like 1 or 2 minutes so we can get more people to join, and then we're going to start. Good morning. If you're just joining us, we're gonna wait maybe 30 seconds or so before we start so others can join us as well. All right, I think we are going to start. Good morning. Thank you for joining us this beautiful Tuesday morning. I was just looking at the weather this morning. It was 79 degrees, so enjoy it because it's going to go up pretty quickly here. And before you know it, full summer is going to be here. My name is Luigi Del Puerto. I'm the associate publisher and editor of the Arizona Capital Times. Of course, the Arizona Capital Times covers state government and politics in Arizona. A lot of people describe us as an independent, nonpartisan, non-ideological newspaper. I kind of refer to ourselves as an equal harassment newspaper. And if you don't have a subscription, do let me know, and we'll get you squared away. This morning we are going to talk about a subject that's immensely important, something that is multifaceted, something that will involve multi-pronged solutions, and that is the issue of housing, specifically homelessness and access to affordable housing. First, I do want to thank our sponsors for engaging in this way. Without their support, we could not hold important discussions such as the one that we're doing right now. The Arizona Housing Coalition is a statewide collaborative group leading in the efforts to end homelessness by advocating for safe and affordable homes for all Arizonans. Working alongside its members, the coalition is the leading statewide voice to raise public awareness about the men, women, children, seniors, and veterans experiencing or at risk of homelessness in the state, as well as the policy solutions to address housing stability. Thank you, Arizona Housing Coalition. Also, I want to thank the Vitalist Health Foundation, which is on a mission to connect, support, and inform initiatives to improve the health of individuals and communities across the state. Established following the sale of the St. Luke's Health System to a for-profit corporation in 1996, the foundation operated a St. Luke's Charitable Health Trust and St. Luke's Health Initiatives in previous years. Over its history, Vitalist has invested nearly $125 million into Arizona health in areas ranging from statewide health policy to local community gardens. Along the way, the organization established itself as a thought leader, convener, framer, and catalyst of key health initiatives and coalitions. And finally, I want to thank Zillow for also engaging as a sponsor. Zillow, of course, is among the leading real estate and rental marketplaces dedicated to empowering consumers with data, inspiration, and knowledge around the place they call home, and connecting them with the best local professionals who can help. Zillow serves the full life cycle of owning and living in a home, and that includes buying, selling, renting, financing, and remodeling. Its database boasts of more than 110 million US homes, including homes for sale, homes for rent, and homes not currently on the market, and as well as estimates of home values, rent estimates, and other home-related information. Zillow also operates the most popular site of mobile app real estate apps with more than 24 apps across all major platforms. And again, I want to thank all our sponsors this morning for engaging in this way. We are very fortunate and very to have such a powerhouse panel this morning. I want to introduce Carol Ditmore, Director of the Arizona Department of Housing. Director Ditmore has over 2 decades of experience in state government and senior management responsibility within Arizona's housing programs. She previously headed the department's operations for over 15 years, directing a broad portfolio of divisions and services that included legal services and procurement, and overseeing annual resources totaling more than $300 million. She served as interim director since 2017 and for a period in 2009. Director Ditmore also chairs the board of directors of the Arizona Home Foreclosure Prevention Funding Corporation, a nonprofit corporation established by the state to serve as the eligible entity for a federal grant for the U.S. Department of the Treasury. And she also serves on the Governor's Recidivism Reduction Gold Council Housing Subgroup and co-chairs a long-term housing solutions subgroup as part of a homeless reduction effort focused on Maricopa County's unsheltered homeless populations. Director Ditmore, thank you for joining us this morning. Are you just from home, ma'am? Are you? How often do you go to your office nowadays?
I've been going to my office maybe about once a week. We have an executive team who each one of us takes a day in the office, and then 80 or 90% of our staff are teleworking right now, and we're all anxious to get back in the office more often. I haven't seen some of my staff since winter, and I'm aware that at the end of the week we're in summer, so we've missed a whole season.
Yeah, and you know, if you're going back to the office during the summertime, you know how it is.
Yeah.
And also joining us this morning is Representative Jeff Winiger, who is the chairman of the Commerce Committee of the Arizona House of Representatives, and is serving his 3rd term for Legislative District 17. Is it 3rd term? Is that right, Representative Winiger?
Yes, 3rd term.
Yeah, of course, Legislative District 17 includes Gilbert, Sun Lakes, and a large portion of Chandler, where Jeff resides with his wife Janet and their 3 children, Jacob, Christian, and Grace. Representative Winiger is the co-owner of 2 local restaurant concepts with 3 locations in the East Valley and 2 kiosks in the Sky Harbor Terminal 4. Representative Winiger and his wife both serve the community in philanthropic work with charities for children, veterans, and youth in crisis. Before serving as a state representative, Representative Winiger served on the Chandler City Council for 8 years and held the position of vice mayor. Sir, how is your restaurant business doing?
Pretty good. Actually, I mean, we shut down 1 restaurant completely. 1 is open. 1 is closed right now because we did have an employee with a COVID case, and in an abundance of caution, we closed down literally an hour after I found out. It was before we opened. So
I guess that's the kind of situation we're all facing, right? You have a coworker who has COVID-19 and you got to decide as a business owner whether to shut down your operation as a result. How is your staffer doing?
Good. They're hanging in there. We're hoping after this, I'm going down to the place and we're hoping to reopen on Wednesday, which would make us close for an entire week.
Wow. Also joining us this morning is Joan Serviss, who is the executive director of the Arizona Housing Coalition, a merger of the Arizona Coalition to End Homelessness and Arizona Housing Alliance. The Arizona Housing Coalition is a statewide advocacy organization whose mission is to be a collaborative association leading in efforts to end homelessness and advocate for safe, affordable homes for all Arizonans. The coalition is also the proud home of the Arizona Veteran Stand Down Alliance, a statewide effort to connect homeless and at-risk veterans with the services they need. Joan has over 20 years of experience in program coordination with a focus on educating the community about issues of social need through state and federal legislative advocacy, community organizing, coalition building, and public relations. She holds a bachelor's degree in political science and a master's degree in public administration, and both from Arizona State University. Joan, thank you for joining us this morning. Are you just at home?
Yes, I am, and I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Also joining us this morning is Dr. Skylar Olsen, who is the Senior Principal Economist at Zillow. Dr. Olsen is a Senior Principal Economist, as I mentioned, at Zillow, and she joined the company in the summer of 2012 and built a team focused on investigating local housing markets and the importance of place in economic outcomes nationwide. Dr. Olsen is often quoted in newspapers and featured in news and radio programs across the country. She has offered testimony on fair housing before the United States House Financial Services Committee, and she holds a PhD in economics from the University of Washington, specializing in econometrics. Did I pronounce that right?
Econometrics.
Econometrics, there you go. And environmental economics. And she was honored for teaching excellence by the University of Washington. Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me. Absolutely.
And finally, we have CJ Hager, who is the Director of Health Communities for Vitalist Health Foundation. She oversees Vitalist Health Community strategies, including food systems, transportation options, green space access, and affordable housing. She works with partners to bring health into the public policy decision-making process through tools such as health impact assessments and health in all policies. Prior to joining Vitalist, CJ Hager was with the Morrison Institute for Public Policy at Arizona State University, where she co-authored Dropped Latino Education and Arizona's Economic Future, and she also held positions with NeighborWorks America, Minnesota Housing, and Minnesota House of Representatives. She serves on the boards of directors of Trellis and the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, the local advisory committee for LISC Phoenix, and as the co-chair of the Arizona Health Improvement Plan's Built Environment Strategy. CJ, thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So let's get right into it. And correct me if this data that I got is wrong. In 2019, we had more than close to 63,000 people who are homeless in the state. Dr. Ditmore, can you provide us a brief overview of what where we were in our homelessness problem in the state just before the pandemic and where we are at right now?
Sure. Thank you for letting me talk about this. We always look at this long range at the Department of Housing, and then we're always looking at where have we come from and where are we going. And so statewide homelessness is actually in 2019 down 27% over where we were a decade ago when we were in the Great Recession. So that's the good news. In places like Pima County, down 60%. Which is also good. In Maricopa County, it was down about 6%. So not as good in Maricopa County. The big thing you're seeing in Maricopa County is that we have an overabundance of unsheltered homeless. So it's almost like the numbers have shifted where 10 years ago, you would have said that most of our homeless were sheltered. Now they're unsheltered. They're very visible. They're in the heat. And so it's a very difficult situation. And I would say our homeless population is changing from what it was a decade ago. And those root causes of homelessness now may be a little different than they were then. In Maricopa County, like I said, there's a lot of unsheltered homeless. Part of that is because the federal government over the last decade really got away from providing funds to states and localities to provide transitional shelter where someone who'd lost their housing could go into a transitional housing situation for a period of time so that they could get themselves resettled, find a job, and then go on to house themselves. Those opportunities really went away over the last decade, and so we've suffered because of that. And so what we find is that our homeless are more and more on the streets. The other thing that we're finding is that more of our homeless population are suffering from substance abuse issues and mental health issues. And those are two big areas that we really need to address. Those are root causes of some of the chronic homeless population who can't seem to get out of it, or they cycle in and out of it. At Department of Housing, we are working with Access. We're working with Department of Economic Security. We're working with the Health Department to try to address some of those situations, to try to get the chronically homeless off the streets. We don't have a full picture of what homelessness will look like through 2020, but right now our homeless providers are extremely challenged in how to address the distancing, social distancing that they need to in their shelters where the beds may be very close together. And so they've had to figure out different ways to address it. One of them is that motel vouchers are being used right now, especially for our more vulnerable populations, and a lot of tenting. And in Maricopa County, we're working with the county, we're working with the Human Service Campus to try to see if we can do some more of that, especially now that the summer heat is upon us. And it's going to be a very difficult summer, I'm sure. The good news is that the federal government is putting a lot of money into homelessness. HUD is sending over $200 million to Arizona between local governments and the state. Most of it actually is at the local government level.
Is this on top of, I'm sorry, is this on top of what we used to spend every year?
Absolutely. This is COVID-19 related funding specifically to address these issues. And so we're going to have more money than we've ever really had to address this population, which is the good news. The governor quickly put $5 million of his crisis contingency fund into homelessness very quickly when things started shutting down, and we knew we were going to have a situation here where we needed to social distance our homeless. And at the Department of Housing, we worked with the Department of Administration. They put about $2 million aside for safety and PPI and paper goods and all kinds of extra cleaning materials for our shelters statewide. And they bought those in bulk at the state and then delivered those to all of our homeless providers statewide. We're getting ready to assess the situation to find out what they need now to get them through the rest of the calendar year. And we'll be making more deliveries this summer along those lines. We also went out and provided over $3 million worth of grants to provide some extra staffing to the shelters around the state. And so that money would probably get them through this up to about the summertime. And we were trying to fill a gap until those federal funds could become available at the local level so that they could get the additional amount of assistance that they need for extra staffing for the motels and so forth.
Oh, thank you for that. Thank you for that overview. I wanna ask Joan, what are you seeing on the ground? Director Ditmore talked about the difficulty of social distancing in a shelter environment, and and correct me if I'm wrong, I can't really see how you establish social distancing in such a tight space.
Ultimately, what this pandemic illustrated is that you need to have a safe, affordable place to call home, to shelter in place, to recover if you get sick. Ultimately, it also shone the spotlight on those who don't have that safe, affordable place to call home, and the Herculean work that our statewide shelter providers do in outreaching to folks who don't have that, who are living on the streets, and assuring that they don't acquire or transmit COVID-19. There has been a shift away from that congregate shelter model, and as the director mentioned, more of the utilization of hotels and motels and spacing. But it's a real challenge. It's a real challenge.
So, I want to bring in CJ. I talked to one doctor in the, a leader in the medical field. And one of the things that really stood out from that conversation I had with him was that he said, like, if we spent more on housing and make sure that for one, homeless population are in a housing environment, or if we just do our best to make sure that housing is more affordable, we solve like a host of problems. Like we can try to manage the mental issues that Director Ditmore had talked about, substance abuse. If you're in a home environment, or if you're actually in a house or in a room, in a rental place, it makes it a lot, I shouldn't say a lot easier, right? But it's less challenging than when people are on the streets. I guess same question for you, CJ. What are you seeing on the ground right now? How has this pandemic sort of brought to the fore these problems that are, for one, associated with homelessness and issues of affordability in housing?
Yes, I'd like to really ground housing. I think you started this question off really well with housing means so much. It is really the linchpin of so many other indicators of success. And so you can look at housing in a very basic way. Having shelter is exceptionally important to health and well-being. The ability of children to do well in school, the ability of employees to show up and be ready to work. The environment in which that house is contained, the neighborhood, impacts so much as well. And it impacts your access to healthy food, your access to park space, your social interactions with your neighbors. And then at an even larger level, housing usually takes up the biggest portion of a family's budget. So if it is outsized, if it is bigger than it should be, it starts to squeeze out lots of other things that go into creating healthy people and healthy places and healthy economies. People will make trade-offs, like trading off healthy food in order to make their rent. They won't go to the doctor as frequently. They may not make fill their prescriptions as frequently. So, from that lens, housing is so exceptionally important to both individual well-being and health, but also the health of communities and the health of our economy.
So I want to go to Dr. Olsen first before going to Representative Winiger. Dr. Olsen, you're looking at the trends nationwide, right? So you have all this data. Tell us about what the, what kind of 2020 are we going to see in terms of rental housing? How are sales at the moment? How are rental and housing prices at the moment? When do you reckon I can only surmise, and correct me if I'm wrong, I can only surmise that, housing sales probably went down dramatically, right? How are we looking at right now? What does 2020 look like? And when do we sort of come out of, of this crisis?
Absolutely. Yeah. So when we're looking at housing right now and watching both the reaction to the crisis itself, everybody pulling back that economic activity, and also the course of the recovery, or even our thoughts in terms of where the resilience is and what markets are vulnerable, it's a very different story if we focus on the for sale side, right? When we talk about, yes, buyers and sellers pulled back dramatically, incredibly in response to the crisis, social distancing, we're, quarantining or isolating in place. But on the for sale side, there's a lot of reasons to see resilience. One, we're watching it happen. We're seeing buyers return really dramatically. So to give you some incredible examples, right? I mean, as pending in the Phoenix Metro, for example, dropped radically to the part where you're looking at, over 30% down relative to last year, but buyers return very quickly so that now you're actually only, a little bit less than 1% down from those 2019 levels. Okay, so we're seeing the recovery in the for sale market. A lot of it has to do with the fact that credit was pretty tight beforehand. There's a housing finance, apparatus that surrounds a homeowner. Those advantages aren't, as felt as heavily for the rental market. So there are lots of things that would make the rental market more vulnerable, greater incidence of unemployment, right? From non-essential businesses. Generally, those workers are more likely to rent than, say, office jobs that can be done remotely. So they're experiencing the crush of the unemployment loss and the income loss more. You're also in a market where, to one of my previous panelists mentioned, right, where a larger share of your housing expenses comes out of your income for renters than for homeowners who can be advantaged by refinancing with record low mortgage rates, right, to get a handle on that mortgage payment. You also have an instance in the rental market where for sale markets are often propped up by the fact that you could have a supply and a demand response. In other words, it kind of balances itself out. Yes, buyers pulled back like crazy, but sellers pulled back too. When sellers pull back, that can prop up prices, that can leave existing homeowners safe with their home equity. They can feel more confident, right, not to lose that source of wealth. You know, in the rental market right now, it's becoming pretty clear that rent payments are being propped up by those unemployment benefits. Without those unemployment benefits, the ability to pay your mortgage, the sheer size of this job loss and income loss means that there's less value flowing through into the rental space. We actually, I mean, Phoenix and Tucson metropolitan areas had rent growth like crazy. That reflected a lot of people coming into this market. That made rent burdens high, made it hard to save for an emergency, and that makes people vulnerable to this conversation. But imagine this shock with this income loss. We actually started to see rent fall in April. Now, by May, rent had stabilized. Why is that? Because it takes a little while for the unemployment benefits to get to the renter, so that they can then, you know, flow that through to the landlord or handle under expenses. So, you know, rental markets and renters are more vulnerable over the course of this crisis in the for sale market, where we're already starting to see that recovery. One of the other things too that I worry about, as much as rent softening and lowering feels like, oh, that's, you know, good for the renter, let's remind ourselves that it's only happening because it's such a hard time for renters. And now you look at the long run, right, in terms of how do we long run handle housing affordability issues. You need more units. If rent goes soft, it's very hard to get any financing for new buildings. That means over the long run, the pressure is going to come right back on rents when, you know, knock on wood, everybody, the economic recovery, you know, is complete, right? And people are back to work, and people are continuing to move to Phoenix and Tucson because they offer, you know, greater affordability than other metros, and the job growth was previously looking very strong. So I do worry about that long run affordability that absolutely makes renters much more vulnerable in a crisis.
So let me ask Representative Wieninger, but by way of asking you, sir, you know, I want to note that Governor Doug Ducey issued an executive order to delay eviction orders for folks affected by the pandemic, right? So the order is in effect for 120 days. And if I'm not mistaken, that expires in late July. So in my mind, we kind of solved one problem. We got a lot of people suddenly unemployed. There's an executive order to halt their evictions temporarily. It lasts for, you know, 120 days. But by the end of July, you know, what I foresee happening is eviction notices, right? So you'll see a flood of eviction notice. So we sort of, you know, solve one problem, one immediate problem, and sort of kind of created, you know, another problem at the end. Let me get your thoughts on that one. And then, you know, what, I guess the question for you is that now we have this potential, you know, in budget, in fiscal terms, we call it fiscal cliff, but we have this problem that we're facing. You know, what are your thoughts on that one? How do you foresee the legislature, you know, if and when it goes into special session, trying to do something to maybe help with this, you know, potential problem that's headed our way? Representative Wieninger, I think you're on mute.
There we go. I didn't want my dog disturbing anything. I think it's a multifaceted issue. I don't think it's just, hey, there's a fiscal cliff. I mean, the unemployment money and these other things were supposed to help pay these bills as you're going through this process. And then you run into another problem. I mean, we're trying to open the economy back up where people get back to work. Without getting back to work, we don't have the economic activity to support a lot of these things that are being talked about in the future. We have to get the economy going, which I think Arizona is doing, and people have jobs, they're paying income tax, they're doing all these things that allows us to fund education and hopefully fund the housing trust fund and do these different things. I mean, that was the whole idea of the Affordable housing tax credit is to get that economic activity that essentially pays for the housing to go there into the areas that it's needed. So I don't know. I don't even know if there's going to be a special session, but I think I would be using this time to try to, let's get our economy engaged again and get people back to the job site.
So you mentioned a tax credit bill that you had introduced, and correct me if I'm wrong, legislation seeks to establish a credit against individual and corporate income taxes and insurance premium taxes for projects that would qualify for the federal low-income housing tax credit. And so under that proposal, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the Department of Revenue would provide or allocate $8 million in affordable housing tax credit each year. And before the legislature had to suspend the session, right? It was it already passed out of the House, your chamber. It had 45 votes for it. It went to the Senate, and I think it passed out of Appropriations, Senate Appropriations Committee. And so it was kind of ready to get voted and passed. Correct me if that's wrong. Where are we on that legislation, and what's the difficulty now if we go into a special session and try to get this one approved in a special session? What are the challenges?
Yeah, it's pretty much everything you said was correct. We got it out in a bipartisan way out of the House, 45 votes. It's not an easy bill to run, but then we did get it out of committee, and it was heading to the floor in the Senate, and then all this happened. But I will tell you that Senator Carter had a bill that had the same exact language in it that she had amended into it, but then also had money for the Housing Trust Fund, I believe. And that got out of the Senate, I think, with close to 23 votes, but it was in the process where it hadn't even made it to committee. It wasn't going to have a chance. And plus, without knowing the budget, it would have essentially kind of been a money bill because of the money attached to it, where mine was a money bill, but it's money 3 years down the road. And it's money that is only expended if there's economic activity and if this building is built and if it's completely full. So it was a very important bill. I'm hoping we can revise it at some point, or revive it, but it almost made it to the finish line. And that was a little frustrating because there was a lot of really important bills at the end of session. And we heard people on both sides talking about pet bills and this and that, and diminishing some of these things that would have drastically helped during this time in the next few years. And they were dismissed and lumped in with everything else for whatever reason, I don't know.
So if you're, thank you again. If you're joining us this morning, I want to ask our viewers and our listeners, please send in your questions. Again, we're starting to see some of the questions already, but please do send in your questions, and we will try our best to get to as many of them as we can. There was one immediate question about what bill number it is, and it's bill number 2732, House Bill 2732. That's the bill that Representative Winiger, introduced, and as he had mentioned, was almost ready to get to the finish line, if you will. Director Ditmore, I want to ask you, so as I mentioned, I can imagine there's potential flood of eviction notices. That doesn't necessarily mean that people will get evicted. The tenants, the landlords, and of course, the tenants will have to, I imagine, navigate through that and find a way to perhaps negotiate. But how are we, correct me if I'm wrong, first of all, if you see the same problem that I'm seeing, and how will we manage it?
Well, what we're trying to do at the state is we're trying to provide some rental assistance to folks who are not able to pay their rent. Very soon after people started losing their jobs, we came out, the governor announced that we could use $5 million in Housing Trust Fund dollars to establish a COVID-19 rental assistance fund. We've been working with the community action agencies. There's 11 agencies around the state that work at a local level to help renters pay their rent. And so we launched that program very quickly. One of the challenges that we had is normally when people get in trouble with their rent, they'll go into the community action agency and they'll meet face-to-face with a counselor. That was no longer possible. So we set up an electronic system so that people could apply online. That has its own challenges. People sometimes aren't as techie as we would like them to be, and so people have been challenged with applying and uploading documents. We've had over 15,000 people apply for that assistance. We are nearing probably later this week about $1 million of that $5 million expended to assist with the rent. There are a lot of folks that never completed their application and never provided all the documents. So we've taken a really hard look at that system. We've tried to be flexible. We've made it easier to upload documents. We've reduced the number of documents that are needed. And so anybody who's been interested in applying, or even if they were not previously eligible, we would ask them to go back and take a new look at the system, and if they still need assistance to try to get assistance through that system.
I'm sorry, you mentioned so you mentioned 15,000 people had applied for it. There's $5 million. I can imagine the average rent or the average application might be somewhere, about $1,000 or so, right? Between maybe 900 and $1,000. And so if there's 15,000 people, that's, and correct me if my math is wrong. I've been wrong with my math a couple times already, but that's $15 million.
Yeah. $975 is where we are in average assistance right now. What we're finding is, like I said, a lot of people haven't completed their applications. So we asked ourselves, is that us or is that them? We've tried to improve the system so that it's very easy to get in, less documents need to be put in, but people still are not completing their applications, which tells us something else. And that is that right now, at this point in time, a lot of people have other ways to pay their rent. The National Multifamily Housing Council put out a report last week that said less than 7% of the apartment renters nationally are behind in their rent, which means they are finding resources to cover their rent. Between the federal unemployment that they're now getting, as well as the stimulus funding, tax refunds that you get this time of year, I think people are carving together enough money to keep themselves, most of them, on time with their rent. We've talked to the rental properties in Arizona that we are engaged with, and most of them have very low numbers of people who have not been paying their rent. So right now, we're at a good place. I think because of the federal unemployment, our concern will be what will happen when that runs out. There's some talk about extending it possibly, but people need to go back to work or have additional funding. I mentioned the $200 million that is going to be available from HUD for the state and the local levels. They're looking at that. Some of them are setting aside some of that specifically for rental assistance. I know that in Maricopa County, there's probably going to be in the tens of millions of dollars available for renters coming this summer when they get their programs up and running. So we're kind of a little bit of a bridge here at the state and working all over the state to try to kind of bridge that time before the unemployment started, and then we'll be working with all of the counties and the cities to try to make sure that all of our resources, not only the state's resources, but those that they have available, get out for those renters that will need a little more prolonged assistance, maybe once the unemployment runs out.
So before I saw Dr. Olsen raise her hand, but ma'am, I want to ask Director Ditmore just real quick, the $200 million that you mentioned, a lot of the money actually goes to the local governments, correct? So
yes, it does.
It's a local governments that's going to manage that amount, and so
yes.
They have their existing programs. Okay, cool. Dr. Olsen, you raise your hand, ma'am.
Yeah. I just wanted to follow up. I absolutely agree. Something though I think that's really hard in this environment is really getting a full picture of what's happening everywhere. So I also really am watching that the data coming out from the National Multifamily Housing Council as well, and am very encouraged, right, by the rent non-payment was much better in May, then in April, and in June, then in May, so things are getting better. But I think a lot of that too is this unemployment extension benefit, all support. But something to also really consider when you're thinking about that particular thing is that they cover probably 30% of renters, mostly in prime rental apartment buildings. So when you think about who's able to pay rent at this time, you either got the unemployment check in time, to pay your rent, or you were lucky, and you were able to work remotely. And so, something that I think when we think about the rental market, we think about the full range of that income spectrum, at the bottom, rent burdens are almost inevitably higher at the bottom. They take up a larger share of your income in general, and that rule of thumb, right, that everyone says, like, don't spend any more than 30% of your income on rent. That's, not just, that's, that comes from someplace, right? There's lots of research that shows when your rent burden exceeds 35%, 32%, there's different cutoffs in different places, but one, the relationship between rent growth and homelessness becomes much stronger. Two, one of the reasons why that is, right, is rent burdens that exceed 35%, the share of households able to save anything, really drops, right? So 2/3 of households who have high rent burdens above 35% save nothing. That's not just no retirement one day or no down payment one day. That's nothing. The average savings of a high rent burden household is $10.
Wow.
So something that I worry about a lot in this environment is it's so full picture of what's happening because so much is happening. But also B, it's another story and kind of reinforces, it's the lucky, right? The maintaining employment, getting access to support and services, and then often the
yep.
a lot of vulnerability.
So Joan, I want to ask you, I'm sorry, CJ, you raised your hand as well. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate, I think we won't know the full story for another year or two until the data comes in. So we have to really disaggregate the data. So I think it does sound promising at a very high level that renters are able to scrape together whatever pieces they can to make the rent. One of the questions I'd be asking is, where is that coming from? Is that coming from not taking your kids to the doctor for their annual visit? Is it coming from not being able to eat food that's really healthy? Where is that coming from? And then who is that falling on? And Dr. Olsen really mentioned this. She mentioned income, but I'd also suggest race and ethnicity.
Oh, yeah.
You find that more people who are rent burdened are people of color than white folks. So this is not happening to everyone is not experiencing this the same way. And the other thing, I just wanted to throw in here, I think that one of the interesting things that's going on in Arizona and Phoenix and Tucson is it's both an affordability problem. So your income is not right sized to the rent, which shows out in the data. Rents have been increasing faster than incomes, especially in Phoenix and Tucson. But then also there's a lack of supply. And you can address that affordability through vouchers and one-time payments like the director was talking about. But the supply issue, that's not solved quickly. That's years. You won't see new units built with new state money or new federal money as much as it's needed. We won't see those units for years. So this isn't something that we're going to be able to suddenly come out of, 1 month we're going to be just fine. This is going to be a problem for years.
So before I go to Joan, I want to ask Representative Winiger just real quick, sir, how does your bill, CJ mentioned the fact that, if you're building, it takes some time to build, it takes some time to get into the system, and market the new rental units and, get people in and all that. But how will your proposal, help in this regard?
Well, yeah, it takes some time. It definitely takes some time when a bill isn't taken up and voted on and actually into law. So then it takes a lot more time. But this also applies to rehabbing. units as well. So it's not, and converting from a certain kind, it's older, whatever, updating it and then putting on the market as this. And they claw back that tax credit if you're not keeping up with everything. And there is robust checking on these things. So it takes time, but there's a lot of things that takes time. I mean, there's justice reform that we haven't talked about. My wife goes out at night and literally helps homeless people in the middle of the night. This is before she had a nonprofit. She probably has personally had 5 different people that she's converted from being on drugs and different things and is in housing and has a job and everything now. So she sees it on the front line. I see it because I've gone down with her many a times right by Cass, where you do great work, and fed people out there and given them clothes and blankets. Yes, there's definitely problems all the way around, but it is a global issue. It is people being let out on probation and having intense probation that is practically impossible to meet the standards of having a job, but you have to leave that job every day or every other day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to go do certain things. I'm not saying you shouldn't have probation, but I've seen where I've literally helped and picked up one of these gentlemen that my wife was interacting with, and he was sent by the courts to a sober home in the worst part of town. When I drove up, there was 50 young men in the streets. They weren't, it just wasn't a good situation. You can know that there's a very low chance of somebody succeeding these kinds of things in that. So justice reform, which we worked on last year, which I think up to 1,000 extra people are going to be left. It's just multifaceted. But back to your original question, yes, it would take a little time, but it's going to take a lot longer time if we don't get the bill passed.
I think that the problems you mentioned just sort of bring to the fore the fact that housing is so complex. The problem of homelessness is so complex. There's so many attendants to it, and the solutions have to be just as complex. Joan, you were going to jump in there, and after you jump in there, I want to ask you a question. All right, so let's say I'm facing, I'm not able to make my rent for whatever reason. Like, where do I go? Who do I call? I instinctively assume I'm gonna, people are gonna have a computer and an internet and all that, but that's probably a wrong assumption.
Right. Well, here's the good thing. As the director mentioned, there are eviction prevention programs set up from the State Department, and other municipalities are looking to set up and stand up their own program as well with this CARES funding. They are looking at, and props to Director Ditmore for having a relationship with either an Office Depot or a Staples, so that constituents can come in and scan their paperwork and submit it through that online portal, so you don't have to have an internet connection at home. The silver lining of the fact that there's only about $1 million of that $5 million for that program that has been expended is that when the eviction moratorium is lifted, that's when I think many of the families and renters are going to say, oh gosh, I have this huge rental arrears that I have to address. And so, ultimately, we've been at the Housing Coalition, we've been advocating and that landlords and tenants really work together, really kind of focus on that relationship, strengthen their communication, strengthen the education, that they need to work together, because ultimately it is that symbiotic relationship. Renters need that safe, affordable place to call home, and landlords, we need them as a crucial partner, because they are our supply side of affordable housing. We do, as has been mentioned, this is a very complex issue, but a very, foundational issue. So we need to think about what are the policy levers that are at our disposal. At least at the state level, we know some of those, and thankfully Representative Wenninger has been a huge champion of that. We know that we can restore the State Housing Trust Fund, which, was swept during the last housing bust. It would have been so amazing if it had been restored back to its original 55% of unclaimed property, because it would have been more responsive during this COVID-19 pandemic.
That would have meant about $40 million a year in available funding, correct?
According to JLBC, each year would have generated, because of the sophistication of now pulling your unclaimed property, it would be about $9.6 million impact
Okay.
to the state
All right.
general fund.
Okay.
But again, it would grow and be responsive and fit the needs. And again, to the department and the governor's credit, they quickly allocated that $5 million to that eviction prevention program. But I think we also need to expend some of the crisis contingency and safety net fund. There's about $30 million left that really need to be pushed out through the rest of the state to some of the homeless shelters. And then come July, I think that's a source of funds, or end of July, August, September, when unemployment runs out, when there's no more stimulus funds, and when the eviction moratorium is lifted, people are going to be scrambling, families are going to be scrambling for housing assistance. So we need to look at, all the different policy levers, like the rental assistance, to make families and the landlords whole. And then, ultimately, Representative Weniger's bill, and as CJ mentioned, we need to be thinking now and in the future. We already had an affordable housing crisis. There's not enough units. Enough vouchers alone isn't going to be the conversation. We need more housing units. So had that bill, House Bill 2732, passed, and again, it doesn't have a state general fund impact until it's occupied and until it's constructed. But when you say tax credit, I'm sure some people kind of get a little nervous about that. But the reality is that we actually commissioned a study with Elliott Pollock. The study showed that over 6,000 units would be created, over 2,447 jobs would be construction jobs would be created from that, and about a $6.2 billion economic activity over the course of that program. So that would be giving back to the state, local, and local jurisdictions and schools, some of those folks that have some real concerns about tax credit. But really, this would have been a really forward-thinking proposal, and we're still hopeful that our legislators will take this issue up.
Yeah, you mentioned tax credit, and you immediately have natural allies and then natural critics. But I want to get to questions from our viewers and our listeners. So I think we've answered most of these questions. One, for example, was asking about funds being allocated to provide support for people to maintain housing. Once you have that housing obtained, I think we've answered most of that. Judith says that she's terribly concerned about the huge increase in low-income families with children losing their housing when they can't pay their rent after eviction forbearance ends. What are the predictions for Pima and Maricopa County? Director Ditmore, you want to take a stab at this question?
Well, I don't think we can really predict it now, but like I said, the good news is that there are a lot of federal funds that are going to be available, more than I've ever seen in my 25 years of working in state housing. And I think that those resources are going to be invaluable in making sure that people don't fall into homelessness.
Barbara is asking about whether our panel members see, so here's the question. What do you see, and will government be willing to help developers create this next generation of housing? Representative Weniger, you want to take a stab at that question?
Yeah, again, that's a complex issue, but some of it is going to have to do with cities and zoning and different things. I know my last couple years that I was on Chandler City Council, it was coming out of the recession, and tons of apartments had been approved during the recession because there was no money for really anything else to build housing, and housing come to a complete standstill. And we just got pounded constantly about no more apartments, and so you're dealing with the constituent mindset. You're dealing with zoning regulators who have been there for 30 years in a city and say, no, this is the way we do it, and this is the way we're going to do it. You have bureaucracy. Like you were saying earlier, there was some comments about how you submit things, and people don't have computers, and making it easier. One bright spot, I think, in this pandemic is some of these executive orders and some of these efficiencies. You see that, okay, maybe, you want to be safe, but maybe there is a regulatory authority that is just a little too overburdensome on certain things, and they do inhibit developers from building things. So I think that you do need to have some different ideas, whether that be affordable housing, whether that be zoning for tiny housing, which I know Phoenix, I think, has done a couple of. my wife was in Israel and had seen, in a lot of the airports and different things, they have these little tiny rooms that you can go in, I mean, can you get the zoning to build some of that where it's still privacy and more transitional and that kind of thing? I mean, I think there's some great ideas. Real quick, I do want to say believe me, I'm worried about the cliff with constituents and people too. But one thing we haven't talked about is the landlords and the people who own the properties. I mean, they're paying banks and bills and stuff too. And
they're still paying taxes or required to pay taxes.
Right.
Yep.
And if all of a sudden they can't do that, then again, it's the totality of our economy that's going down. Then we don't have more money. I mean, it's all a cycle. We don't have the money if people aren't back to work and people are being foreclosed on buildings because they haven't been paid. That's not helping our economy to have more money to put into these programs that we need anyway. Yeah.
The issue with the renters, with the landlords and the managers, I mean, that's one other big, challenge and questions surrounding those. At some point, I do want to have that discussion specifically with that issue as well. But CJ, you were raising your hand. Go ahead, ma'am.
Yeah. And thank you for bringing up cities, Representative Winninger. We've really been focusing on the state and a little bit on the federal government, but there are many other parties that have a stake in everyone having a safe place to call home. So right now, I think later today, actually, the city of Phoenix is going to be considering an affordable housing plan. And these are there's no dollars associated with it. It's how to incentivize it using what cities naturally have to incentivize the development of affordable housing. Perhaps even cut down on that time that we were talking about earlier that it takes to actually build homes, which naturally happens.
So
can I add a couple more?
Yeah, go ahead, yes.
A couple of the other partners that are coming up to the table, health insurers are seeing that poorly housed people cost them money. And so the health insurers in Arizona are starting to come together with LISC Phoenix to develop a housing fund, which is really wonderful. And you're seeing lots of other partners, including the Urban Land Institute, who are looking at what ways can we incentivize workforce housing. So this is a problem not only for the state government and the federal government, this is a problem for all of us that we can contribute to.
So, Director Ditmore, just real quick, what's the status of the $200 million in federal funding? Has it actually been distributed to local governments? If not, when will it be available?
Each government is having to come up with a plan that they will submit to the federal government to get that approved. And so they're all at different levels of where they are in their planning for their money, but it will be available as soon as they can each submit a plan to HUD and get that approved at the federal levels.
One of the things that I think happened during this pandemic very clearly is that hotel occupancy, went down. So here's one question from Mary. How can we incentivize hotel owners to convert to affordable housing? In fact, I've seen some of that efforts already, but maybe one of you can take a stab at this question.
The only thing I'll add is that we are getting some guidance from HUD on how to use community development block grants to acquire hotels and motels and transition them to housing options for individuals. And I think that that's the right thing to do because it's a false promise and a moral imperative when you take somebody and provide them that safety, especially during the hot summer, and then post-pandemic, whenever and whatever that looks like, put them back on the streets without a housing plan. That's heart-wrenching. So I think that that's the right thing to do.
So, Representative Winninger, here's one question for you. Would the legislature consider suspending provisions that mandate accelerated time or deadlines for eviction process? I guess this question goes to, what we talked about, which is that, come late July, the executive order is then lifted. Do you see the legislature taking up this issue?
One, it depends if we have a special session, back to the item of everybody wanting to adjourn and they're not in control of whether or not there's a special session. I guess it would depend if it's a global thing. Is it for landlords and them too? But I think the main point is trying to get people back into jobs and back working to get the entire economy going again.
Director Ditmore, here's a question for you. Of the people who have completed their application for assistance, what percent and how many have received assistance so far?
Right now, it's 11% of all the determinations that we've made. We hope to have that number go up here in the next few weeks and months, and we'll just have to see. We're not making predictions on the exact number, but we do know that we have $5 million set aside that will all be used for that purpose.
So, here's a question from Suzanne. I think, CJ, you kind of answered this one, but are the cities working on housing plans to address the longer term issues, and what are developers doing to look at different options?
Yeah, as I mentioned later today, I think at 2:30. So if you live in Phoenix, you can tune in to the City Council considering an affordable housing plan. And it doesn't actually allocate funding for it, but it looks at all of the other tools that a city can have to incentivize the development of housing that's affordable to a wide spectrum of folks. The city of Tempe did something similar about a year ago, and they're having some really great results. So I think really looking to your cities. Also, I mentioned the health insurers who are doing some wonderful things. I do need to also mention that the Phoenix Community Alliance and Howard Epstein have developed, along with the Arizona Community Foundation, have developed the Arizona Housing Fund, which is capitalized through voluntary fees at real estate transaction events. So you're asked when you're purchasing a home and signing your deed, would you like to donate $25 to help house people in Arizona? And that, I think, is up to more than $250,000. That's separate from any sort of government whatsoever. That's completely private sector. So I think there's some really promising things. And I think the other element to note is that it's not one single solution. It's multiple solutions that we need to take a look at.
And we are almost out of time. I'm sorry, go ahead, Joan.
Okay, I'll real quick. I'd add that, CJ mentioned Phoenix Community Alliance. We're seeing, federal, state, local partners, but we're also seeing the business and philanthropic community come to the table because they know that to attract a business and attract employees, you need to have a safe, affordable community to call home. So that's great.
Yeah.
So here's one question, and I don't think we will have the time to answer it, but it sort of encapsulates the kinds of challenges that we face with access to housing, affordability, homelessness, right? So here's one from Becky. Good morning. I used to do some housing advocacy work in my spare time, and I found that late rent pauses made it difficult to catch up. Do you see the housing industry being responsive to difficulties of being out in a COVID environment, getting on a bus, going to the bank to get a cashier's check, etc., to meet the threshold of the payment and payment terms that require once you're 3 days late? Joan, just real quick, you want to take a stab at this question?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of the relationship between landlords and tenants working together. We're going to see a lot more efficiencies. We're already seeing that at the state level, a lot more efficiencies in the way we do business. And I hope that continues. I hope that continues.
I'm sorry, Representative Winninger, did you raise your hand? Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, real quick. I think it's a good question, but it talks about and kind of goes to how many issues we deal with at the legislature go into these kinds of things. I ran a bill called Prop Tech Sandbox, which allows property technologies, whether it be someone like Zillow or different people, to test if there's a regulatory burden or there's regulatory ambiguity. It allows you to test kind of products. And the more we can get those technologies where a lot of people, even the homeless people I run into, a lot of them have cell phones and different things, to where there's this seamless kind of fintech payments and different things that can go through those things. And so technology in the future can help these items.
I want to wrap this up by just asking you real quick, just a few words. What has been the silver lining for you during this pandemic? Representative Winninger.
Well, that's tough because I own restaurants and I'm in the legislature, so I've been dealing with it a lot. I guess the sense of community, seeing a lot of people come together, just reiterating the loyalty of my staff, and just that sense of community of people helping out one another, which I've witnessed a lot.
Director Ditmore.
I think everybody working together so quickly. We've been working closer with our county and city partners and the community action agencies than we normally would over a several year period. We've had to talk to them constantly, which is a good thing. And I think together we'll help solve some of these issues.
CJ?
I think that there's been a focus on people who are normally ignored. So those who are most impacted by COVID-19, I think people are recognizing that. And oftentimes those folks are in plain sight suffering day to day. And now it's really showing up right now. So I think we're seeing, and hopefully we're absorbing and becoming empathetic to the everyday inequities that we see in our world.
Dr. Olsen?
Yeah, I think mine is a similar flavor to that answer, is this recognition that there's some real serious hardship. And I think it's causing us to also look kind of more at where it came from to try and address, the systemic problem, right? Rent burdens, rent outpacing income. That's a long run dynamic that started, even before a bunch of foreclosed homeowners were dropped onto the rental market. It was also we stopped building density in the burbs. We stopped building duplexes and triplexes. We really cracked down on what we were able to build in different communities, and this is the end result of that. And now this greater recognition that these problems have always been here, and the crisis has really pulled off the blind on it.
And finally, Joan?
Honestly, it's the intersection between housing and healthcare, and knowing that our sector, our community, has amazing folks that know how to do the work. Our case managers, our outreach workers, the developers, the landlords, everyone knows how to do the work. We need the political will and the financial resources to make it happen. And then we can solve these major, very multifaceted problems that lay ahead of us.
Joan, Dr. Olsen, Representative Winiger, Director Ditmore, and CJ, thank you so much for spending the time this morning. To our viewers and our listeners, thank you again. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.